Okay, take it away, Mary.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to see everyone this morning. I'm zooming in from Florida, where it's 72 degrees today. So hopefully we can send our warm weather all of your way. But I'm so happy to be here to be talking about one of my favorite topics and how it applies to low flutes specifically. So about 5 years ago, Nicole Chamberlain and I, who many of you may know, especially from her flute choir music and her solo and chamber works that include low flutes. We wrote our very first method book together called Beatboxing and Beyond that covered 14 of the most common types of extended techniques for flute. And we did so in a way that presented one extend. Oh, thanks, Chris. Got mine here too. We organized it in a way that introduced each extended technique alone so that we could learn the techniques before we got to that really complex process of trying to do two at a time or alternate between several extended techniques. But our other goal through this book was really describing all of the ways that extended techniques can help our traditional flute playing. So there's a whole section on the extended techniques that help our tone, the extended techniques that help our breathing and our support, the ones that help with ear training. And if I were to go through all 14, it would take more than an hour. So what I did this morning is really isolate the extended techniques that are really effective on low flutes. A lot of them sound even better on low flutes, or the ones that we see most in the solo and the chamber and the flute choir repertoire for low flutes. So I picked, click here, I picked 6 for us to work through together this morning. And what we'll do is first just talk about how to execute the extended technique first, how to practice it and build it up. And then I've included little excerpts from our etude book to start practicing them. And then I've also included some excerpts from our standard, alto flute or bass flute repertoire where we might see these things. So whatever low flute you have with you today, feel free to try each of these on the low flute of your choice. I've got my alto and my bass with me right now, but all of these are equally effective on contrabass flute too, so we can take these and apply them over here. So as we go, I welcome questions. I want to make sure that I'm getting to all of your questions and also that you can ask them while we're still on that topic. So as we go, if you have a question, feel free to just unmute and let me know, and then we can cover that before we go on. So we'll start with a lot of people's favorites, and one of the things I think that we see most common in our low flutes, especially in flute choir repertoire, the low flutes are so fantastic when it comes to executing these beatboxing and percussive syllables. So I thought that that would be a fun place to start this morning and just to get our air moving, because beatboxing syllables are really, really great for support. So the thing about beatboxing syllables, we always like to clarify the difference between our beatboxing syllables and beatbox flute playing. Beatbox flute playing, Greg Patillo has a phenomenal method book that he wrote to talk about basically how we go back and forth really quickly between a beatbox sound and then a traditional flute playing sound. Whereas the beatbox syllables are the syllables that we make over the tone hole of the flute so that we get the right? Those are all our beatboxing syllables. Whereas when we're beatbox flute playing, we're often making the beatbox syllable away from the flute and then playing flute in between. So beatboxing syllables are a really nice place to start. And really anything that's a combination of a consonant sound at the beginning and then any vowel sound at the end could be a beatboxing syllable. So it encompasses everything from a boo, poo, za, cha to a sh or ts, ts. They can be really loud and percussive, or they can be very soft and spooky and lyrical. So whenever we get started with beatboxing syllables, with most of these techniques actually, I like to start away from the flute first to make sure that we're getting the embouchure and the air set up, and then go ahead and add the flute to it. So we're gonna start with some boos and some chaws this morning. So the first thing that we wanna do is just get the syllable going as loud as possible without the flute, and really focus on the embouchure and aperture shape. So we'll start with some boos. You can all stay muted, but we'll do a call and response. So we'll start with a boo where we vocalize, but try and get a lot of pressure here in the lips so that we get our and as I'm making the boo sound, I'm really engaging my abdominal muscles right here. So if you put your hands over your abs, you should feel that pressure of the as we're doing each syllable. So let's try this together. Let's do a measure of quarter note boos. We'll do 4 beats of boos. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. And you'll notice that as I'm making the boo sound, I'm getting a nice popping sound, and it's because I'm executing the boo with my lips forward and the interior, the wet part of the lip touching, as opposed to curling my lips in and getting more of that B sound. When we're speaking a B, we typically curl our lips a little bit. Ba, ba. When we're doing the beatboxing syllable, we want to keep the lips forward with a and that's what'll help us get that really percussive effect. So we would practice these several times to build up the endurance. My advice is always to build up more beats of the syllable than you need to play either the piece or the etude or the excerpt that you're going to be playing. So if we were working our way up to, let's say, 2 measures of boos, we would want to get ourselves to 4 measures before we then added the flute and went over to the piece. So the next step, once you feel comfortable with your alone, is to grab your flute of choice. So I'll start on bass flute, but everything we do today I'll demonstrate on bass and alto. The key to setting up the beatboxing syllables is to make sure that we are more rolled out than we would be when we play normal flute. So normally when we pick our instrument up, we have it slightly tilted back toward us and we're aiming our airstream down into the flute. With beatboxing syllables, we want to make sure that we're aiming the air across and over the flute so that we don't get the flute tone. If I aim down, I'm going to get a where it overblows and we get a harmonic with a lot of air sound. When we roll out, what we're hearing is the percussive sound, and then all of the air at the end of the syllable is going over the tone hole, and we're basically using the flute as an amplification system. Okay, so experiment, of course, with bass, with the curved head joint, and with alto, if you have a curved head joint, that setup is going to look and feel slightly different. I'll say that on my bass flute, I'm very far rolled out. So the edge of the tone hole is right at the edge of my bottom lip. I would not be able to make a real flute sound in this position. And that's our So as you try it, experiment with rolling in and out, right? We want to find the limits of the sound. You'll hit a point where you roll in so much that you start to hear the flute tone. And we'll also hit a point where we roll out so much that we no longer hear the flute amplifying the pitch, where it just becomes a popping sound, but we don't hear the pitch of the beatboxing syllable. Okay, so that's our boo. We're gonna try now an open mouth syllable too. So closed mouth are the boos and the poos, whereas the open are the chas and the zas. And the key to these is to make sure that you can see your teeth. And that is not what we normally do when we play the flute. So when we say cha, 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 and za, 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 we want to keep the lips open because we're going to be really tempted to make that flute aperture that will get us our beautiful flute tone. We've got to keep that open. So again, without the flute, we'll try some chas, C-H-A, cha, 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 cha. And you'll notice that I'm not vocalizing. I'm not saying cha, cha, or za, za. It's just going to be the percussive sound with the air coming out. Cha, cha, cha. Same thing, you can put your hands on your abdominal muscles and feel the pressure. Cha, cha, cha. Okay? And when you feel comfortable with that, we'll do the same thing where we go ahead and we add it to the flute. We're going to want the same setup where we're rolling out too much to make a real flute tone. So we get the cha, 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 rather than when we roll in, cha, 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 we're going to get that flute sound, okay? So rolling out and then paired with, make sure that you can see your teeth. So especially right now when we're on Zoom, if you can see yourself, it should look like cha, 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 cha. And the way that we get faster is by keeping the mouth as closed as possible, cha, 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 rather than when we open, cha, cha, cha. That's really going to slow us down. So work on basically how closed can I keep the mouth, how little space can I have between the top and bottom teeth in order to get, eighth notes or 16th notes that we'll sometimes have to play in beatboxing syllables. So I thought we could try putting this together. This is a little excerpt from our Etude book. This is the beatboxing syllable excerpt. One thing I always like to point out here is the difference between a cha, C-H-A, or chew, C-H-O-O, versus just the C-H. Just the C-H is going to be faster. We get the ch, 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 as opposed to a cha, 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 okay? So here she uses a C-H only, and that's because if we look ahead, it's the speed of the rhythm that we're about to play. We want to be able to go a little faster. So let's try all together speaking just the beatboxing syllables in rhythm. I always tell my students when we're working on these things that the moment we start an extended technique, we're tempted to not, check the key signature, or subdivide the rhythms, or do all of those standard things that we're trained to do. So it's nice to have that intermediate step where we're just placing the beatboxing syllables with the rhythms to make sure that we've got the right rhythm before we start getting the flute involved. So let's all speak this together. We'll go slowly at about a ch, ch right there. And then you'll see the boo. We'll say a boo over an eighth note. And then the CH comes in on the next eighth note in measure 3, and the CH remains for the rest of that measure. Okay? So we'll just do some sight reading with beatboxing syllables. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then and then shh. Good. If you're feeling a little bit dizzy right now, that's normal, especially if you're new to doing prolonged beatboxing syllables in a piece. So I give the same advice as back when we were all beginners playing the flute. If you get a little dizzy, just go ahead and take breaks and work your way up to the longer and longer sections. So we also covered in here one TS. That's going to be the hi-hat on the drum kit, a sizzle, and then one SH at the end, shh. That's going to have a little bit more back pressure inside the mouth, okay? Let's go ahead and add the flutes. Feel free to try this on your alto or your bass. I'm going to do this one on my bass flute as we play. And let's try it at the same tempo that we just played. So 1, 2, 3. It's a really, really nice sound on the bass flute, especially some boos. One little tip I always give my students is if you're spitting a little bit, you're doing it right. There's going to be a lot of high pressure happening in this, and so that's very normal. It's a sign that we have a good amount of back pressure happening. So that's a nice introduction to our beatboxing syllables. I've included a little excerpt here. With each technique, I'll show you a piece that uses these different extended techniques for low flutes. So this is a little excerpt from Flexion by Nicole Chamberlain. This is written for solo alto flute. If you've played her flute choir music, though, you know that beatboxing syllables are in a lot of her pieces, and she especially uses them in the low flutes. So this is a really nice example of putting in some beatboxing syllables interspersed with some other extended techniques like timbral trills. She's got a little bit of stomping in this section, and then she also has multiphonics and some other extended techniques in this piece. Before we go on to the next technique, does anyone have any questions about beatboxing syllables? And feel free to unmute if you do.
I'd like to double check you're not engaging your tongue with the beatboxing syllables. Is that correct?
So we will be engaging our tongue with some of them. On a boo or a poo, for example, we won't really engage the tongue. The tongue is resting in the bottom of the mouth while we're using the front of the lips. On other syllables, though, like the SH and the TS, sh, sh, or ts, ts, we will be engaging the tongue. So it depends on the syllable and relate it to when we're speaking that particular consonant syllable. So when you're speaking a boo, for example, the tongue is resting, a b or a p. But when you're speaking a ch, 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 then the tongue will be engaged there. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Okay, let's go on and we'll do a little bit of pizzicato tonguing. So pizzicato tonguing, it works so beautifully on the low flutes. And pizzicato tonguing, the name comes from pizzicato on string instruments. The key is to produce a technique that sounds as much like we're plucking a string as possible. And the C flute, we're going for, violin register pizzicato tonguing. And then the alto flute, it should sound a lot like viola pizzicatos. And the bass flute starts to sound a bit more like cello pizzicatos. So this is another form of percussive articulation. Oftentimes you'll see it used in the same pieces that are using beatboxing syllables. But the key to pizzicato tonguing, and the thing that makes it a little different from like slap tonguing or overblowing harmonics, is that we don't want to get any residual air sound. Because the minute that we get air sound in there, it no longer sounds like a string instrument. So that's the key to this one. So pizzicato tonguing, similarly to the beatboxing syllables, we're going to start without our flutes and just really work on the technique. I'll play an example just so you know what we're aiming for as we get started. That's our pizzicato tonguing. Should sound like the plucking of the string. So this is another open mouth technique where you'll be able to see your teeth when we're doing the pizzicato tongue. You're going to take your tongue and firmly place it on the hard palate. So it shouldn't touch the front teeth at all. It should be behind on the hard palate, where if you have ridges on the top of your mouth, right about where those start. So the tongue will be upward. And then we're going to create a little bit of suction, a little bit of pressure, and then pull downward with a. The key is not to vocalize at all, so we don't want to ta, ta. And we're also not blowing a lot of air after we release. We're not doing a tu, tu. That would start to become a beatboxing syllable if we blow through it. So the pizzicato tongue is just created by the release of the pressure, Okay. This is creating back pressure. And as flutists, we are not used to back pressure, especially if we play low flutes a lot. So we'll find that when you start doing several pizzicato tongues in a row, you might find this sort of guttural sound happening because there's some back pressure that we need to release. So when we pizzicato tongue, you'll find on breaths that you're actually releasing air rather than taking in air, similar to our oboe and trumpet friends. So let's try a few measures again without the flute. We're gonna go, and you should end up with a nice popping sound. Your mouth does not have to open, but some people find that they're able to execute the technique more effectively when they do. So it can look like that, or it can look like this. Either one is fine. The only difference is going to be speed. It will be a little slower if we're fully opening our mouth on each one, okay? Now, when we add the flute, it's gonna be very similar to the beatboxing syllable. So I'll do this one on alto flute. So go up into your normal playing position where you would make a beautiful flute sound, and then we're gonna roll out. You should feel the edge of the tone hole kind of on the top of your bottom lip, so far rolled out that we wouldn't be able to make a nice flute tone. And then we add the one thing that we like to try when Nicole and I are doing this live, we call it the sneaky flute exercise, where you start with just the technique without the flute, and then sneak the flute up and bring it to your face. The reason why this is helpful when we're new to these techniques is because the moment we put the flute to our face, we want to go into normal flute aperture and position. We're so trained to roll it in and to create that shape. In a lot of the beatboxing syllables, pizzicato tongue ram, we don't want that perfect flute shape. We want to be more rolled out. So if you're finding that you have a hard time picking up the flute and then doing it in the correct position, try just adding the flute to the technique once you've started, okay? Good. So I talk a bit in the break it down in the book about how to get them louder and softer or faster and slower. And that all has to do with just the openness of the mouth. The more open it is, the louder it's going to be, but it'll also be slower. The more closed position we have, it won't be quite as loud, but it'll be faster. So we should pick the one that's appropriate for the piece that we're playing. But what pizzicato tonguing is wonderful for is just building up our single tonguing speed endurance. If we did pizzicato tonguing for the whole entire Tafnel and Gobert #1, then when we go back to single or double tonguing, it's going to feel really easy comparatively. So let's try some pizzicato tonguing. You're going to see pizzicato labeled or marked the same way that we would see pizzicato in a string instrument, but usually we go a step further and actually write the P-I-Z-Z also to differentiate it from any other extended techniques. And then the norm is going back to our normal sound. So let's go ahead and we'll do the same thing that we did with the last etude. This is an excerpt from our etude book, where we practice just the pizzicato tonguing without the flute once to really look at these rhythms, okay? So we'll go about 1, 2, 3, 4. So rest, 2, 3. Rest, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then we'll stop right there for right now, okay? Great, so let's go ahead, and as we put it together, the key is gonna be on the pizzicato tongue, we're rolled out. And then when we go to our real sound, we have to roll back in and go to our normal flute embouchure, and then quickly roll back out to do the pizzicato tongue. So that's the challenge and the skill that we're building in this etude. All right, I'll give us a, subdivide the 8th note and give us a bar of 4. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So if you were on bass versus alto, you're getting slightly different tone qualities, but hopefully we were all starting to hear that viola or cello sound and the pizzicato tonguing. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? And here I'll click so you see an example in a piece. Does anyone have any questions about pizzicato tonguing?
Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Do you exhale because
Great question. So we're not exhaling like a ta, ta sound because that air that we release would then make a sound on the flute. We would get so instead, we're exhaling on short rests in between whenever we feel that back pressure release. So we would go, and we try and release in between on the rests. Does that answer the question?
it answers the question, but like I'm trying to tone, but I'm not getting any
The
tone.
pit sound? Sure.
Like
Do you
the-
mind? Yeah. Do you mind trying for us while you're unmuted, and I can give you a couple of, or I can give you some feedback based on what I hear?
Sure.
Great.
Like I don't get the like.
There it is. Okay, yeah. So what I'm hearing, it sounds like the tongue is perhaps flattened a bit, or there's a lot of surface area between the tongue and the roof of the mouth that'll give us almost a CH sort of sound. Try if you can get just the tip of the tongue to touch the roof of the mouth. Almost, sometimes the tongue will even curl back a little bit and get almost a D feeling. Duh, duh, duh. There you go. Yeah, yep. And if we start to hear that click happening, that's a sign that the front of the tongue is not touching the roof of the mouth. It's more of the middle of the tongue touching. So listen for that if you start to get the click. And then we just would want to fix that by curling the tongue, taking the tip of the tongue and placing that up on the hard palate. Yeah, that sound is really nice. And then when we put that to the flute is just amplifying it. It's just making it louder. You want to try adding it to the flute? Yeah, I'm hearing that, the popping, yeah. So keep working with just that tongue placement. As we experiment with tip of the tongue, center of the tongue, right, we can get the tip of the tongue sound is a T-A-T-A, whereas center of the tongue, we get almost a C-H, or a when it's the back of the tongue. So work with that, feeling like the tongue is curled upward and we're getting the popping sound. So that's I think the key to unlocking the sound. The air sounds really good, flute placement. It's just about what part of the tongue is touching and then getting more and more pressure as we pull it down. And I want to mention just this little excerpt here. This is a wonderful piece by Eleni Lillois for alto flute and electronics. And you can see here that she uses some pizzicato tonguing interspersed with some beatboxing syllables, the TUH, and some glissandi. So this piece has a ton of extended techniques in it, but it's a really great use of pizzicato tongue as well. So if you're interested in this technique, this would be a great piece to check out. Any other questions before we go on? Another technique? Okay, great. So we'll go to tongue rams next. This is the third in the collection of the percussive articulations. And tongue rams, these are probably my favorite extended technique on low flutes because they're just so resonant and responsive. On the low flutes, I'll actually demonstrate on the bass flute first because it's an even louder, bigger sound. So that's our tongue ram. And we will hear pitches in tongue rams, but it's not the same pitch that you're fingering. The tongue rams will speak at a fifth lower than the note that we're fingering. So for our tongue rams, similar to the other ones, we're going to start by just using our apertures without the flute. And the key to a tongue ram is to make sure that we're stopping the tongue behind the lips. So it's counterintuitive because of the name of the technique, but the tongue is actually not going to leave the mouth. So without the flute, it looks like. So you'll make your normal flute aperture, and then you'll forcefully push the tongue toward the aperture, and then stop the tongue there, and we should get that popping sound. Sounds like a P syllable when it hits the back of the top lip. So without the flute, that's the sound that we should be getting for the tongue ram. And you're going to use a lot of air, a strong amount of air, similar to a jet whistle, I would say. We want it to move really quickly, and then at the end, the air sound will stop when the tongue hits. So the air will move much faster than we would on a normal note on our instrument. So when we do add the flute, we're going to completely cover the tone hole. You want to cushion your teeth with your lips. So wrap the lips around the teeth just a bit, not all the way back, but just providing a little cushion there so that your teeth don't touch the lip plate. Then we're going to completely cover so that we can't see any of the tone hole. And then you're going to do the exact same technique just over the tone hole now. They're most effective and loudest the more keys we have down. So as you're trying these, try a D or an E flat or a low C. I would say that similar to the beatboxing syllables, I'm using a lot of abdominal pressure and engagement. So every tongue ram I go. So as you're practicing it without the flute, feel free to put your hands on your abdominal muscles, and we should feel that happening. It's because of that air and that pressure why tongue rams are so good for our breathing and building up our breathing and building up our support on flute. If we can, again, using Tafnel and Gobert, tried and true, if we can go. I'm using my core, I'm using engagement, I'm using probably 3 times as much air as I would on a normal flute note. All of that is going to really lead to a more supported sound with more air when we're playing with our normal and traditional sound. So those are some side benefits of tongue rams outside of seeing them in pieces. On an alto flute, we're still gonna get that resonance. But of course, it's just a higher pitch. So I think that's why they're so effective on bass flute. It's because of that low booming sound. All right, going on, here's a little excerpt from our etude for tongue rams, where we're practicing in the beginning, just getting the tongue ram with a rest in between to reset the embouchure and take a nice big breath. And then as the etude goes on, we're starting to put them closer and closer together. So when we're new to tongue rams, the goal is just to get the sound to speak. And then as we build it up into a more advanced version of the skill, being able to do several in a row faster and faster is something that we're working toward. So let's do the same thing that we did with the others. We're gonna do the extended technique without the flute in rhythm. So we'll do a Okay. And I know it's in cut time, but since we're all sight reading together this morning, I'll do a faster for a 1, 2, 3, 4, right about there. So let's try it without the flutes, just doing the tongue ram sound, and we can stop at the end of measure 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. It gets trickier as we get toward the 8th notes because we have to very quickly pull the tongue back. I almost think of the motion as 8th note. On the downbeat, we're moving the tongue forward. On the upbeat, we're pulling it back so that it's, or rather in this case, 16th notes. So that way we can get the front end of the tongue to be on time. Okay, let's go ahead and put it together now with the flute. I'm going to switch back to bass flute for this one. Be nice and loud. And we'll try that same tempo now, but with the fingering, stopping at measure 8 or end of measure 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. Go. Good. So you'll find as you're going on, finding that correct amount of pressure here between the lips and the tone hole is going to be really important in getting the sound. If we're too relaxed, it starts to become more like a jet whistle. You have to keep a little bit of pressure between the lips and the tone hole. Tongue rams are very popular extended techniques for the low flutes. I would say we see them most in bass flute and then in alto. We don't see them as much in contra. It is a little harder with the size of the tone hole on a contra to get the tongue ram with the same amount of resonance. So when I have seen them for contra, it's often paired with a key click or something else that's going to help get a louder percussive effect. This is an example of tongue rams from a piece called Run in a Graveyard for bass flute and electronics by Duyun. And she uses a lot of tongue rams. I wanted to use this as an example because she writes out the sounding pitches, and some composers are going to do this and some won't. So this is just, if you're curious, this is the note that will be sounding when you do a tongue ram, but we don't necessarily need to know that in order to play the tongue ram. What you'll want to do if you do see it notated like this is finger the top note, and it's the bottom diamond head note shape that's going to be speaking. Good. Any questions about tongue rams?
Okay, we have a question in
Sure.
chat,
Oh, perfect.
and everybody's getting echo when they talk. So put your questions in chat.
Oh, okay. And I can mute when people are asking their questions, and hopefully that'll fix the echo.
It should.
Yeah.
You'll have to be switching back and forth.
Got it. Okay. And what was the first question from the chat?
Is the head joint rolled out with the tongue ram?
Great question. For this one, it's not going to be rolled out. We can create the effect with our flute in the same spot that it'll be in when we make a normal sound, but we are going to move our head ever so slightly. So if we're here on a normal note, we're going to be here on a tongue ram. So you can leave the flute in place. You're going to slide your bottom lip downward and then cover with the top lip. So your head will be tilting, but the flute can stay where it is. The other option, you can move the flute and keep your head where it is, but then you're going to have to roll the flute backward. I'll say that on C flute, that can work just fine. On bass flute and alto, because of the innate balance challenges, that's a little bit slower and trickier to execute. So I recommend on the low flutes, keeping it upward and then moving your head down so that we go. Great question. Are there other questions from the chat? No? Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll go on next to key clicks. So key clicks are really popular extended techniques on low flutes. They're just so much more effective on low flutes because of the size of the keys. Most of us probably know how to do key clicks, but there's a couple of interesting facts and tips that we learned as Nicole was composing for them more and as I was digging into the pedagogy of key clicks. One interesting thing that not everyone knows is that the pitch of a key click will change if the flute is on your face as opposed to being away from your face. So you can test this if you start key clicking. So I'm fingering a D right now and I'm clicking right hand 3. So I move it away. As you try that, you're going to hear the pitch of the note changing. And then it even changes if you push the flute into your chin more versus release and have a really light grip between the chin and the alto flute. So what we want to keep in mind when we see this technique in our pieces is if the composer specifically says, you know, they want to key click on an F, an E, and an E, that we do keep the flute on our face when we're key clicking. Versus if it's something that's just supposed to be a percussive technique, or I played a flute choir piece once where we're supposed to sound like horse hooves and it could be at any pitch, it was just supposed to be noisy, then the flute can be down and away from your body. The other thing about key clicks is that there's a lot of room for experimentation. It really depends, you know, which finger you click, how loud it's going to be, how easy it is to move from one note to the next. So there's not one right answer for use this finger to click or use this finger to click. It's just about knowing the differences that you're going to get when you make different choices. So this is an excerpt here from our Etude book from the key clicking movement. And a couple things that I want us to try together are hearing the differences between when we click with just, let's say we're key clicking an E, where we're just clicking the last finger, so right hand 2. You'll hear how loud that is, versus if we click 1 and 2. Going to be a little bit louder, but probably a little bit slower since we're coordinating 2 fingers. And then the thumb key, it's important to know, is always going to give us a really loud, boomy key click. But of course, our thumb tends to be a little bit slower than the rest of our fingers. So sometimes we're balancing speed versus volume in the given situation. So here in this excerpt, I practice it multiple ways, and I also have my students practice it multiple ways. I think the first time we do it, we can really just focus on clicking right hand 2 when it's an E, right hand 1 when it's an F, and then right hand 3 when it's an E flat. But then I would also go back and practice this using the thumb on every single key click. And that's a really great coordination exercise. So I love key clicks, again, for traditional flute skills, just working on coordination and alignment of the fingers, just as much as I love it as a really cool effect in solo music and flute choir music. So let's go ahead and read this one together. I'm going to keep the flute on the face again because of the pitches. We'll hear the pitches that she wrote. But on low flutes, again, if your arms are getting a bit tired and you want to lower it and take a little break, that's totally fine as we're learning and practicing together. So I'll give us a 1, 2, 3 at about that tempo, and I'll give us a bar for nothing. 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go, yeah. It gets really tricky at the end there to catch the real notes when they pop up. I often find in key clicks we're so focused over here on the fingers that getting the embouchure in the ear ready to play the real notes can be the challenge with this one when we're going back and forth. So whichever ones you use today, you want to reflect on the volume that you got, the coordination, and then try some other things to get a different outcome. If you're going faster, you want to think about which ones you want to use for speed. But if you're going a little bit slower, think about which ones you might want to use for volume. And of course, key clicks are fantastic on the contrabass flute because of the size of the keys. So the example that I used in solo repertoire is Nicole Chamberlain's piece Imperial Topaz, which she wrote for contrabass flute originally, but it can also be played on bass flute. And you'll see that she uses the key clicks right here with the X note heads interchanged with the flute sound. Good. Any questions on key clicks?
I have a question. I use, for anything that's F or below, I just pop the G key, and I found that that gives me the best tone, and it's so much easier to coordinate that than trying to pop all those fingers down there in the right-hand stack. So that's an option.
Yes, that's another great option. Yep, we can do left hand 3. And then we're just coordinating left hand 3 with whatever's moving for the notes in the right hand. Yeah, that's a great one. 3, thumb is really good. So thank you for mentioning that one. I appreciate it. Any other questions on this one? Okay, great. Well, let's go on to flutter tonguing. So flutter tonguing is often the first extended technique that we learn. And there's 2 different types of flutter tonguing. There's the tongue roll flutter where we're fluttering with the front of the tongue, or a rolled R. And then there is the gargle fluttering where we're rolling with the back of the tongue. Being able to roll your R is genetic. Not everybody can do it. And so if you can't roll your R or roll with the front part of the tongue, then you can exclusively use a gargle flutter. But even if you can flutter tongue with the front of the tongue, the back flutter tongue, the gargle, is really effective for low notes on C flute and then incredibly effective for the low flutes on both alto and bass. The reason being there's less pressure, so we're less likely to overblow and crack these notes when we add the flutter tongue to the low flute. So if you are a tongue roll flutterer, this is my breakdown for the tongue roll. If you are a gargle flutterer, this is my breakdown over here for the gargle. And I always like to note, especially to anyone who's brand new to flutter tonguing, that it does take much longer to build up the gargle flutter. I find that with students, it'll usually take about a month or so till we're at a place where we're getting to consistently use it on the flute and getting it to speak. So just keep that in mind. Be kind to yourself if you're learning the new one. And if we go back to the tongue roll flutter, I'll have us all try some fluttering together, but I'll put in the prompt, use whichever one you're most comfortable with today as we do it. So if you're a front roll, we'll use that one. If you're a back roll, it's the Chewbacca is what it's often called, or the cat purr with the back of the tongue, okay? So we'll do the break it down steps. I'm gonna use the front roll as I demonstrate, but feel free to use either to get it together with the flute. So again, always start away from the flute and start with short bursts of fluttering and then build toward the longer sustain on the flutter. So we're just going to, while vocalizing, get the tongue rolling. So and do your best to just hold it for 2 or 3 or 4 beats. The next step is to remove the vocalization. This is a step that a lot of people when they're first starting flutter tonguing can sometimes miss, and that's how we end up with a little bit of throat sound when we're flutter tonguing. So we want to get to a place where we're fluttering, but without the vocal cords moving. So go ahead and try your flutter, but without the sort of sound. the front, or is the back. If you're doing the gargle, you can throw your head back like you do when you're actually gargling. Here, I'll put the step-by-step for the gargle up on the screen. That'll help get it moving. And then the next step is to add the flute aperture to that. So we're going to do exactly what we were doing, but then close the lips into the flute aperture. So that's our step 3. And each of these steps can take a day or so or practice. I'm just going through them quickly today for the introduction. The next thing that we want to check, the last step before adding the flute, is to put your hand in front of your mouth. And we're going to blow as we would when playing the flute. And the key is to check and make sure that the air size, shape, and direction is the same as when we're playing without the flutter. So we feel the size, direct it right toward the center of the palm, and then see if we can match that when we add the flutter. The key is strength of air. If the air is weaker when it's coming out when we add the flutter, then it's not going to be able to make a sound on the flute. So we do have to use more air when we flutter than when we're playing a normal sound without flutter. And that is one of the reasons why flutter tongue practice is so good for our breathing and increasing your overall lung capacity and air support for the low flutes. So I recommend adding flutter tonguing to your warm-up routine if breathing is a specific goal you have. So after you're able to get that air shape, size, and strength to be the same, that's when we can add it to the flute. So when you bring your flute up, for this one, nothing will be different than from our traditional flute sound and setup. So without the flutter, and then with the flutter. Now, one small tip, the lower we go in the register, this is slightly different from when we're playing a note without flutter. We don't want to let the air angle get too low. When we let the air angle get too low while we're fluttering, we're more likely to crack and overblow the note. Where it will go upward. So we want to keep the air angle across. As we get lower and lower in the register. So that was a low D on the alto. Same's gonna go for the bass flute, and you can try this now on your own instrument. Start to go lower and lower in the register and check to see how high do I need to keep my airstream so that it doesn't overblow to the next register. So for me, it's right when I hit that A flat G on bass. Where normally, if it was a normal note, I would start to move my air angle down much more. But when I'm fluttering, I'm going to keep it a little bit higher so that it doesn't overblow. So if you're new to flutter tonguing, especially on a low flute, it's great to just start in the mid register and going for sustain first. And then the more advanced version of practicing this technique is playing lower and lower in the register. Before we try a little excerpt from the Etude book, does anyone have any questions on flutter, either in the chat or... see. Oh, I can access the chat. Good. Yeah. Oh, great question. So to build up the gargle, do I encourage using liquid? Yes, I absolutely do. Robert Dick has a fantastic tutorial on this on YouTube where he uses water. And usually what I'll have students do when they're learning the gargle method is starting with their head thrown back with water in the mouth for about a week. That's all I'll assign. And then getting rid of the water and being able to gargle with your head thrown back but without the water. And then bringing the head forward and being able to keep the gargle going. Each of those steps I have them do for about a week. And then in the 4th week, we go ahead and we put it together with the flute aperture on the flute. So that is, that's a really great tool to use. The gargle because of gagging. Yeah, so this is a really common issue with the gargle flutter tongue. And I think that gagging feeling comes from a little bit too much back pressure back in the throat where we get the I'm so sorry for the sounds I'm making, but they're essential for teaching flutter tonguing. So we want to see if we can get less pressure between the back of the tongue and the roof of the mouth when we're doing the gargle. That's going to create that gagging sort of feeling. If we can keep the tongue a little bit more relaxed, a little lower, then hopefully it should help with the gagging that can happen. Using the water in the beginning will also help with that. We'll just have less pressure from the beginning if our head is thrown backward and if we have water from day one. So that can also help to just set up really good habits. Yeah, but it takes a lot of time. And I find that not rushing ourselves through the steps is probably the most important part in building up a really good gargle flutter. So I would say be kind to yourself, give yourself the time it takes to work every single step before you jump to the next one. That can help. Good. Any other questions before we try? Oh, let me go back here. Before we try some fluttering? Let's do this exercise together then. Normally I would have us do just the flutter without the flute, but I'm noticing time, so we'll just jump right in with the flute. I'll use my bass for this one. So 1, 2, 3. And the reason I picked this section and what I love that Nicole did here was allow us to practice moving from our normal flute sound into the flutter. And that's what allows us to seamlessly increase the air pressure to get the tongue rolling. So if you're new to this, it's okay to lift and break in between the real note and the fluttered note. But if you're working on just building up your overall lung capacity and you're fairly comfortable with flutter tonguing already, then you can go right into it without space. And I'll say that when we have multiple flutters in a row, you do not have to re-tongue with a single tongue and go ta, 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 ta. The flutter tongue is the articulation. So when you start the, that will be the front of the note. She could write a slur over it just to reinforce that idea, but you don't have to have the slur over it. We would just continuously keep the air and the flutter tonguing moving. So that's one notation thing that Nicole ends up saying to composers a lot, is that we don't have to have the slur. The flutter is just going to connect all the way through. Good. Did I see I think I saw a new question in the chat. So when you're fluttering, oh, good. So I think I just answered that question. Yeah. So we don't need to re-articulate. We can just connect them all together. Good. There was just one more that I had today that we didn't get to, but I'll click through it quickly. It's harmonics. Harmonics are really effective on low flutes. They're wonderful embouchure practice and getting us to use our flexibility muscles. And I particularly love them on bass and alto because it gets us familiar with our air angles on these instruments, which is going to be slightly different from the air angle on C flute. So we really get to memorize the position of the high register air angle and the middle register air angle and the low register air angle. So this is a little excerpt from our harmonic etude. And then this is an example. If you're not familiar with this piece, it's so wacky. I absolutely love it. It's Kate Soper's Only the Words Themselves Mean What They Say for flute and soprano. First movement is C flute, second movement is bass flute, third movement is piccolo. And the bass flute second movement, which this is an excerpt from, is 100% harmonics. You're playing through the harmonic overtone series for about 6 minutes. And it was one of the best things that I ever did for my bass flute tone was learning this piece. So I really encourage harmonics as tone exercises, even if you're not playing them in your music. And the last thing that I wanted to share with you as our low flute community is that the third volume of our etude books is going to be coming out in August. We'll have it at NFA. And it's our low flutes book. So we're going to cover extended techniques for alto flute, bass flute, and contrabass flute. And what we're going to cover in this one is not just the extended techniques on each instrument, but also switching back and forth between the low flutes and switching back and forth between C flute and low flutes, and have etudes that specifically help us practice those things. So today was a little sample of what we're going to be putting into that book, but we're really excited to have something that's just for our low flute friends. Good. Well, I know we're right at time, so I understand if anyone has to run, but if you don't and want to ask more questions, I'm also happy to stay on and answer.
Okay, thank you, Mary.
Good. Thank you, Chris, and thanks for having me.
Okay, so we have to go. See you later. But if you want to stay in there, Mary's going to turn off her original sound.
Yes. So I'll stop the share and I'll.
Okay. So unmute yourself and ask a question.
There we go. Got my original sound off, so hopefully there'll be no more echo.
We won't get that echo.
Hey, my name is Barbara. I'm in Virginia, and I just adore you. My husband's a graduate from Florida State, and my dream when I retire from real work is to be a marching chief.
Oh,
so I was so excited to see that you're offering this today. And I would love to talk with you someday, like to see if it is possible that like I be a marching chief one day.
Yeah, I love that. The marching chiefs are such an incredible community, and I love all of the experiences that our students have in that group. And I would say yes, as long as you are an enrolled student, part-time or full-time at FSU, you can audition for the marching chiefs. So the chiefs is not exclusive to music majors. All of our music education majors are in the marching chiefs. Some of our other majors, performance music therapy BAs, also audition. But in the section, I would say it's probably 1/3 music majors, and the other 2/3 are studying different things. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So how do you teach the extended technique? Like, is it a dedicated semester, or is it just throughout all of your teaching?
Great question. Yeah. So the Beatboxing and Beyond book that I was talking about today, we've worked this into our first year curriculum, freshman year. So they do the Anderson Etudes Opus 15 in the first semester. And then our freshmen do the Beatboxing and Beyond book in the second semester. And that's when they learn all the different types of extended techniques. I'll say, though, that now most undergrads are coming in already knowing a lot of the extended techniques because we're seeing it in high school repertoire. So it's really just about working through the etudes. And then in the second year, that's when we start assigning or having them select pieces that have extended techniques in them. Sometimes we'll have to go teach them even sooner, though, if the bands or the orchestras select pieces that have extended techniques in them. So I think what we're finding right now at the collegiate level is that extended techniques are just more prevalent in all the music that students are playing. So we're trying to find ways to teach them sooner and sooner. But also allow students to incorporate them into the things they're already practicing. So I'll tell my students, you're already practicing Tafnel and Gobert, just add a flutter tonguing to number 1 and add your harmonics to number 2 and your singing it to number 3. So those are some of the ways that work it into the curriculum.
All right. We even have some pieces at church when I play my C flute that I'll kind of be like on the recessional hymn, you know.
Yeah,
we got a great pianist, and when people are walking out, we try to jazz it up.
Oh, I love that. I love it. People enjoy it, you know.
They don't know what's going on, but we're having fun.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. It was an honor today.
My pleasure. I hope we see you here in Tallahassee.
All right.
Chiefs uniform.
I live vicariously through my husband.
Aw, that's great.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Yeah.
For
Quick question, Rachel, quick question. What is the brand of your vertical flute?
I have a vertical Dijau. It's the older style that has a low B. One of our other bassists in our local flute choir has the newer version with a C foot.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I love it. Very happy with it.
That's great. My bass is also a Dijau, and I haven't tried the vertical head, but I would love to.
I adore it.
You do?
Bass
Okay,
has been
good.
my favorite since I learned that the opening title sequence from the old Disney Jungle Book
Yes.
was a bass flute.
With the bass flute. Yep.
I loved flute forever, and I said once I knew that sound was a flute, I said I will own one day.
Yes.
And I
love that.
wanted a vertical one so that I could play it when I'm 85.
That's great. Good.
You're
Okay.
muted, Chris.
I think we should wrap this up. I think this was terrific, Mary. This
Oh,
was
thank
just
you.
fantastic. I learned some things.
Oh, yay. I'm so
I
glad.
did. Okay.
Wow.
You never know. I want to encourage all of you who aren't a member of the Low Flute Society to join, because we have quality events like this. And our next one in March is going to be Karen North, who's in Australia, and she's going to be taking us through one of her pieces that she's written. So the time is a little weird because she's in Australia, but you know, we're trying to be international. But anyway, okay, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Mary, for so much information. This is just terrific. This is
Thank
terrific.
you. Thanks for having me, and I hope I get to see you all in person soon.
Okay.
Happy weekend.
Okay. See everybody later.
Hopefully see everybody at NFA.
Yes. Yes.
Bye, Allie.
Bye.